Welcome to the Sleepy Computer Scientist, where we drift through the technological landscapes that shaped our world. Tonight, we're traveling back through the quiet corridors of gaming history to explore one of the most revolutionary devices ever created, the Nintendo DS. This is not just a story about a game console, but a story about how one company dared to reimagine what handheld gaming could be, and in doing so, change the entire industry forever. The Nintendo DS didn't emerge from nowhere. It arrived at a specific moment in time, carrying with it the weight of expectation, the burden of competition, and the spark of genuine innovation. To understand its story properly, we must first look backward, to see what came before, to understand the landscape that made the DS not just possible, but necessary. When we think about handheld gaming before the Nintendo DS, we think first and foremost about the Game Boy. Since 1989, Nintendo's monochrome brick had dominated the portable gaming market with an iron grip. The original Game Boy was released with Tetris, a pairing so iconic that it became the gold standard for launch titles across generations. With its green-tinted dot matrix screen, its sturdy construction, and its legendary battery life, the Game Boy became not just a device, but a cultural phenomenon that defined what portable gaming meant. The Game Boy evolved through several iterations. The Game Boy Pocket arrived in 1996, offering a smaller form factor and a sharper monochrome display. The Game Boy Color followed in 1998, finally bringing colour to Nintendo's handheld empire after nearly a decade. These weren't radical transformations, but rather careful refinements of a formula that worked. The device was practically indestructible, had an enormous game library, and most importantly, it was affordable. Parents didn't fear giving a Game Boy to their children because dropping it was unlikely to cause permanent damage. However, by the early 2000s, Nintendo's grip on the handheld market was beginning to slip. Competitors were circling with increasingly sophisticated technology. The Atari Lynx, while expensive and ultimately a commercial failure, had proven that color screens and more powerful processors were technically possible in portable devices. The Sega Game Gear followed a similar path, offering superior graphics to the Game Boy but struggling with battery life and bulk. These devices were too demanding, too expensive, and ultimately they faded into obscurity. But they demonstrated an appetite among gamers for more advanced portable technology. The real threat came from a different direction entirely. By 2003, the mobile phone was beginning to evolve from a simple communication device into something more capable. The camera phone was emerging, games were being developed for phones, and there was growing speculation about whether dedicated gaming devices would even be necessary in the future. Meanwhile, the Game Boy Advance, released in 2001, was performing well but faced an aging architecture. It had been on the market for over 2 years, and while it offered 32-bit power compared to the Game Boy Color's 8-bit chip, it was becoming clear that Nintendo needed something more revolutionary to maintain its dominance. The Advance was a success, certainly, with an excellent library of games including Super Mario Advance, The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past, and Metroid Fusion. Its screen was brighter, its processor more powerful, and its battery life respectable for the time. Yet there was a sense in the industry that Nintendo was playing it safe, that they were evolving the Game Boy formula incrementally rather than fundamentally reimagining it. Other companies were taking bigger risks with technology. The Tapwave Zodiac attempted to merge a gaming device with a personal digital assistant. The N-Gage from Nokia tried to leverage the mobile phone market. None of these devices succeeded, but they represented the experimental spirit that was moving through the industry. It was in this context, with Nintendo facing an increasingly complex competitive landscape and growing questions about whether handheld dedicated gaming had a future, that the company's research and development teams began asking a radical question. What if, instead of making the handheld device more powerful, we made it fundamentally different? What if we gave it 2 screens? What if we added touch input? These weren't incremental improvements to the Game Boy formula. They were questions that challenged the entire foundation of how handheld gaming worked. The early 2000s were a time of technological exploration for Nintendo as a whole. The company was preparing to release the GameCube, its entry into the 6th generation of console gaming, which would also feature some experimental controllers and interfaces. Meanwhile, Shigeru Miyamoto and his teams were exploring what motion control could mean for gaming. The creative energy within Nintendo was high, and there was a genuine sense that the company needed to innovate or risk becoming irrelevant. The handheld division, in particular, understood that simply making a faster version of the Game Boy Advance wouldn't be enough to maintain dominance for another generation. By 2003, the concept for what would become the Nintendo DS was beginning to take shape in Kyoto offices and laboratories. The name DS itself wouldn't come until much later, but the vision was already clear. A dual-screen gaming device with touch input. To anyone paying attention to the industry at the time, this seemed bold and unconventional. Critics questioned whether the touchscreen was even necessary for gaming. Some gaming journalists openly wondered if Nintendo was making a mistake in pursuing such a radical design. But Nintendo's leadership, particularly Satoru Iwata and his team, believed deeply that this device could transform the industry if executed properly. The development of the Nintendo DS represented one of the most crucial decision-making periods in the company's history. The project began with a clear mandate: create a handheld gaming device that didn't just advance the technology of previous Nintendo handhelds, but fundamentally reimagined what was possible. This wasn't about processor speed or graphics capabilities, though those factors certainly mattered. It was about creating a device that could do things no handheld had done before. Satoru Iwata, who had recently become president of Nintendo after the company's somewhat disappointing GameCube performance, was instrumental in pushing the DS vision forward. Iwata had a philosophy about gaming that emphasized accessibility and innovation over raw power. He believed that a device should appeal to a broad audience, not just hardcore gamers. This philosophy would shape every decision made about the DS, from its hardware to its software library. The dual-screen concept was driven by a desire to create more immersive gaming experiences. A second screen could display maps, inventories, or supplementary information without obscuring the main action. It could allow for split-screen multiplayer games without the compromised perspective of traditional horizontal or vertical splits. Most radically, the bottom screen would be touch-sensitive, opening up entirely new ways of interacting with games. Touch input wasn't new in 2003 or 2004. Personal digital assistants like the Palm Pilot had been using stylus input for years. But applying touch input to gaming, making it the primary input method for a device, was genuinely innovative. The technical challenges of implementing this vision were substantial. Creating two screens that worked in harmony required careful consideration of the device's form factor. Too large, and the DS would be unwieldy. Too small, and the screens would be cramped. The engineers and designers settled on a clamshell design, with the screens stacked vertically when the device was closed and spread horizontally when opened. This design had several advantages. It protected the screens when the device was in a pocket or bag. It created a natural palm grip when held open, and it gave each screen its own dedicated space. The hardware specifications of the final device reflected a balance between power and practicality. The DS used two ARM processors, one clocked at 67 MHz and another at 33 MHz, giving it approximately the same processing power as the Game Boy Advance, but with the architecture designed to handle dual screens and touch input more efficiently. The RAM allocation, the graphics pipeline, the audio system, all of these elements were specifically tuned for the unique capabilities the DS was meant to enable. The battery life was designed to be competitive with existing handhelds, with an emphasis on portability and long play sessions. The touchscreen itself was a critical technical decision. Nintendo chose a resistive touchscreen rather than a capacitive one, which had implications for how the device would be used. Resistive screens require a stylus or specific pressure, but they're less sensitive to ambient conditions and cheaper to produce. This meant games had to be designed with the stylus in mind, and the interface has to account for the need to hold the device and manipulate the screens simultaneously. Some critics argued this was a limitation, but Nintendo's design philosophy viewed it as a constraint that would drive creative problem-solving in game design. Backward compatibility was another crucial decision. Nintendo decided that the DS would play Game Boy Advance cartridges through a dedicated slot beneath the system. This was a monumental technical achievement. The DS could not have been backward compatible through a simple physical connection. The architecture was too different. Instead, Nintendo had to create emulation technology that would allow GBA games to run on the DS's different processors at full speed. This backward compatibility was a crucial signal to consumers. The games you already owned, the library you had invested in, would continue to be valuable. The naming of the device took considerable thought. Originally considered names included Revolution and various other monikers. Ultimately, DS stood for dual screen, which was as straightforward and honest about the device's innovation as possible. The simplicity of the name masked the depth of the technical and creative achievement behind it. When Nintendo finally revealed the DS at E3 in May 2004, after months of development and refinement, the reaction from the industry was mixed. Some journalists and developers immediately recognized the genius of the design. Others remained skeptical about whether a touchscreen had any place in serious gaming. The pre-launch period was a crucial time for Nintendo to communicate the vision of the DS to developers, publishers, and consumers. The company knew that the device's success would ultimately depend on software. Even the most innovative hardware is meaningless without games that take advantage of its capabilities. Nintendo reached out to third-party developers with an unusual proposal: create games that use the touchscreen in meaningful ways, games that couldn't exist on any other platform. This was a deliberate shift from how the Game Boy Advance had been supported, where many titles were simply ports of console games or straightforward genre entries. The company also made a strategic decision about launch titles. Rather than rushing out a large library of games that didn't really utilize the system's unique capabilities, Nintendo committed to a smaller but more carefully curated launch lineup. Touch! Generations, a collection of simple but elegant touch-based minigames, would become the very first DS release in Japan. It might seem like a strange choice for a launch title by today's standards, but it was actually a stroke of genius. It demonstrated the potential of the touchscreen to a general audience without requiring complex game mechanics or deep engagement. This title, more than any elaborate first-person shooter or action game, would help bridge the gap between hardcore gamers and casual players. The physical design of the Nintendo DS was a masterclass in industrial design and engineering compromise. When closed, the device measured approximately 4.3 inches wide, 3.2 inches tall, and 1.1 inches thick. When opened, it revealed two 3.15-inch screens in a horizontal configuration. This form factor had to accommodate not just the screens and processors, but also the game cartridge slot, the Game Boy Advance cartridge slot, speaker systems, a microphone, wireless communication hardware, and most challengingly, a battery that needed to last for 10 hours or more of continuous gameplay. The two screens, while seemingly identical at first glance, actually served different purposes. The top screen was a standard LCD panel, typically 8-bit color or higher, which served as the primary display for game graphics. The bottom screen was also an LCD, but it incorporated a resistive touch layer, allowing for stylus input. This distinction was important because the touch layer on the bottom screen affected its image quality slightly compared to the top screen, but this trade-off was necessary to enable the touch functionality that was central to the device's identity. The screens themselves represented an interesting challenge in industrial design. They needed to be bright enough to play outdoors but power efficient enough not to drain the battery. Nintendo ultimately chose a brightness level that was comfortable for indoor play and could handle outdoor use in most daylight conditions, though direct sunlight sometimes posed challenges. The contrast and color saturation were carefully tuned to match the Game Boy Advance's screen characteristics, so players could transition between older and newer games without a jarring visual shift. The clamshell form factor was revolutionary for handheld gaming in 2004, though it borrowed inspiration from previous designs. The Motorola Razr would popularize the clamshell form factor for mobile phones later that same year, but Nintendo had independently arrived at this design because it solved multiple problems simultaneously. The screens were protected when the device was stored in a pocket or backpack. The top screen naturally faced the player when the device was held in the correct position. The hinge created a natural resting angle for playing games. The design also created a strong iconic silhouette that made the DS immediately recognizable. The hinge itself was a critical component that Nintendo invested considerable engineering effort into. It needed to open and close smoothly through potentially thousands of cycles without becoming loose or creaky. It needed to support the weight of two screens, a processor board, and various other components without straining. Early models used a relatively robust hinge mechanism, though later revisions would become the subject of some durability complaints as the device aged. Nintendo's insistence on durability meant that the hinge had to be strong enough to last through years of regular use by children, teenagers, and adults. The processor configuration was somewhat unusual for gaming devices. Two ARM processors, rather than one powerful CPU, might seem like a step backward compared to more powerful single processors. But this dual-core design allowed for better power efficiency and helped Nintendo manage the heat output, important considerations for a portable device. One processor ran the game at 67 ms, while a secondary processor ran at 33 ms and handled system tasks and wireless communication. This separation of concerns meant games could run smoothly without interruption from system processes. The wireless capabilities of the DS were genuinely innovative for a handheld device in 2004. The system used a proprietary wireless protocol for local multiplayer games, allowing up to 16 players to connect for compatible titles. This wasn't Wi-Fi, which would have consumed far too much battery power for a handheld device at that time, but rather a more efficient wireless standard. More importantly, the DS included the ability to transmit game demos to other nearby DS systems without those systems having the cartridge. This demo download feature was crucial for social gaming, as players could share experiences with friends before they bought their own copies. The microphone was another unusual inclusion on a handheld gaming device. Many devices had audio input capabilities, but few gaming systems made the microphone such a central part of their identity. The presence of a microphone on the DS signaled Nintendo's intention to explore voice commands, voice chat, and voice-based gaming mechanics. Games like Kirby, Canvas Curse would use the microphone for sound-responsive gameplay. Others would explore voice recognition and voice chat features. While not all of these experiments would prove successful, the microphone's presence opened creative possibilities. The pressure-sensitive stylus came with the device, attached to the system via a small slot when not in use. This was another important decision. The stylus was easy to lose, which led to third-party manufacturers creating replacements and alternative styluses. But by including the stylus as a standard part of the package, Nintendo ensured every DS owner had the proper tool for touch input. Some critics complained about the stylus's small size and the need to hold it while playing, but these design constraints were actually features that encouraged developers to create more deliberately with the touchscreen in mind. The color options for the original DS launched in Japan included Pearl White and Jet Black, with Midnight Blue and another variant following relatively quickly. Each region would eventually see exclusive colors. This color variation was a marketing strategy that allowed Nintendo to offer visual variety without substantially changing the hardware. It also encouraged some consumers to collect multiple units in different colors, or to upgrade if they'd purchased an early model and preferred a different aesthetic. The Nintendo DS launched in Japan on December 4, 2004, amid considerable anticipation and skepticism. The price point was 15,000 yen, approximately $140 USD at the time, positioning it as more expensive than the Game Boy Advance, but within a range that serious gamers were willing to pay. The initial launch lineup in Japan included Touch, Generations, which became the system's best-selling title in the early days, along with Super Mario 64 DS, a remake of the beloved Nintendo 64 classic that demonstrated how the touchscreen could be integrated into three-dimensional platforming. Super Mario 64 DS was a masterstroke of launch software. The original Super Mario 64 was widely considered one of the greatest games ever made, so releasing an enhanced remake on the new system was a powerful statement. The touchscreen wasn't forced into the experience, but rather provided alternative controls and augmented the game in meaningful ways. Players could use the stylus to manipulate Mario's face in the game's menu system, or take advantage of touch-based mini-games. The game was both familiar and new, which helped early adopters convince themselves that the DS was worth buying. The Japanese launch was successful, with approximately 75,000 units sold in the first week. This wasn't the explosive launch that the Game Boy had experienced, but it was respectable and showed genuine consumer interest. Japanese gaming culture had always been more experimental and open to new peripheral controllers and input methods, so the DS's touchscreen received a warmer reception there initially than it might have in Western markets. Nintendo's own game library, particularly Touch, Generations and the Mario remake, demonstrated the system's capabilities effectively. The Western launch came approximately 2 months later, on March 21, 2005 in North America. Nintendo had used those intervening weeks wisely, both to address any manufacturing issues discovered in the Japanese launch and to build anticipation in Western markets. The North American launch featured a similar launch lineup to Japan, but with some regional differences. The marketing message in Western markets emphasized the dual screens and touchscreen more heavily than it had in Japan, where word of mouth had already established the console's key features. The North American launch was even more successful than the Japanese one, with over 500,000 units sold in the first month. This was partly due to the larger market size, but it also reflected genuine enthusiasm for the console. Nintendo's marketing strategy had emphasized accessibility and innovation, positioning the DS not just as an upgrade to the Game Boy Advance, but as a genuinely new type of gaming device. The tagline, "Touching is good," was memorable, if occasionally subject to misinterpretation, and the advertising showed a diverse array of consumers using the device, from children to adults. The European launch followed in June 2005, completing the major regional rollouts. Each region saw slight variations in the launch lineup and marketing approach, but the overall message remained consistent. The Nintendo DS was a revolutionary handheld gaming device with unique capabilities. The price remained relatively consistent across regions, typically in the $130–$150 USD equivalent range, positioning it as a premium handheld, but not so expensive as to be prohibitively costly for casual players. One crucial factor in the DS's successful launch was the company's commitment to third-party support. Nintendo had learned from the GameCube that exclusive first-party titles alone couldn't drive console success. They actively courted third-party developers, demonstrating the touchscreen's capabilities and encouraging creative implementations. Major publishers like Electronic Arts, Activision, Take-Two, and Ubisoft committed to publishing games for the system. Some third-party titles succeeded brilliantly, while others were less impressive, but the diversity of software was crucial for the console's broad appeal. What made New Super Mario Bros. Significant wasn't just the game itself, but what it represented. Nintendo was demonstrating that the DS wasn't only good for touch-based puzzle games and minigame collections. It could deliver traditional, well-designed gaming experiences that appealed to hardcore players. The game was enormously successful, selling over 30 million copies worldwide across various Nintendo platforms, but the DS version was a particularly strong performer. Players who had been skeptical about the console now had a flagship title that proved its legitimacy. The Pokémon franchise came to DS with Pokémon Diamond and Pearl in 2006. The generational expectations around Pokémon were enormous. Each new generation of Pokémon games was a global event, and players expected the DS versions to be comprehensive, compelling entries in the series. Diamond and Pearl delivered. The games featured the largest Pokédex yet at that point, a completely revamped game engine built for the DS hardware, and genuinely new mechanics like the introduction of physical versus special attack differentiation. The touchscreen was used for the Pokédex and menu systems, making information access more convenient. While some complained that the games felt less innovative than previous generations, their technical accomplishment and content depth were undeniable. Nintendo's own software library expanded rapidly through 2006 and 2007. The Legend of Zelda: Phantom Hourglass was in development, but wouldn't release until late 2007. Meanwhile, Brain Age arrived in late 2005 in Japan and early 2006 in the West, becoming one of the most significant games in the DS's history, though not in the way traditional gamers might have expected. Brain Age was a collection of mental exercises and puzzles based on the work of Dr. Ryuta Kawashima. The game asked players to perform simple mathematical operations, memory tests, and other cognitive tasks, then tracked their performance over time. This seemed like a game for an older demographic, for people who didn't typically play video games at all, and yet Brain Age became a phenomenon. Sales exceeded 30 million copies worldwide, making it one of the best-selling games of the entire generation. The game attracted an audience far beyond traditional gamers. Adults who had never owned a gaming console suddenly found themselves interested in Brain Age, Parents bought it to accompany their children. Older players found it engaging and useful. Brain Age represented a fundamental shift in what Nintendo was willing to make, and who it was willing to target. The success of Brain Age sent a signal to the entire industry that there was an enormous untapped market for gaming devices among casual and non-traditional players. The touchscreen proved remarkably versatile as a gameplay input method. Rhythm games like Osu, Tatakai, Wendon, which released in Japan in 2005 and came to North America as Elite Beat Agents in 2006, showed that the touchscreen could enable rhythm gameplay without the need for specialized physical peripherals. Players would tap the touchscreen in sequence with the music, and the visual feedback made the experience satisfying. The game was quirky, charming, and utterly unique to the DS, which helped establish the console's reputation for housing novel gaming experiences. Third-party developers were beginning to find their footing with the platform. Ubisoft's Splinter Cell. Chaos Theory brought stealth gameplay to the DS with reasonable success. Capcom's Mega Man series found renewed success on the platform. Square Enix ported Final Fantasy III to the DS, a game that had never been localized for Western audiences before, and the game was beautiful on the portable system. Level 5 developed Professor Layton and the Curious Village for the DS, establishing a new franchise that would define mystery gameplay on the portable system. Dragon Quest IX would eventually become a phenomenon on the DS, particularly in Japan where it was a cultural moment. The Game Boy Advance slot's presence in the original DS meant that the console had an immediate library of hundreds of games available at launch. This was a significant competitive advantage when compared to other new consoles, which typically had small launch libraries. Players could walk into a store and buy a DS with the knowledge that not only would new games be available, but their entire Game Boy Advance collection would work with it. As the DS library grew and became increasingly compelling, the importance of backward compatibility diminished. Eventually, Nintendo would release DS models without the GBA slot, and few customers would complain. The cartridge format for DS games was noticeably smaller than Game Boy Advance cartridges, and almost impossibly small compared to Nintendo 64 cartridges. This compact form factor was partly a result of the improved technology in memory storage by 2004, but it was also a deliberate design choice. The smaller cartridges were less expensive to manufacture, which meant games could be produced more affordably. They were also less prone to getting lost or accidentally stepped on because of their diminutive size. The trade-off was that the cartridges were extremely fragile. The gold connectors could easily be bent or damaged, and easy to lose. This would later drive the digital distribution of games on the DSi and DSi XL. Sales figures throughout 2006 showed the console gathering significant momentum. By the end of 2006, approximately 17 million DS units had been sold worldwide. This compared favourably to the PlayStation Portable, which had launched in Japan in December 2004 and in North America in December 2005. The PSP was a more technically powerful device with impressive graphics capabilities, but it was also significantly more expensive, with a higher price tag and more expensive games. The PSP had its own strengths, particularly its excellent video and music capabilities, but the DS's lower price point, innovative hardware design, and increasingly strong software library were proving more attractive to consumers overall. In 2006, Nintendo faced a decision about how to evolve the DS line. The original DS, which would retrospectively be called the DS Fat, or Original DS, had proven successful, but it had some limitations and criticisms. The screen brightness, while reasonable, could have been better. The device was somewhat thick by modern standards. Some consumers found the overall feel slightly plasticky compared to what they hoped for. Rather than abandoning the successful original design, Nintendo chose to create a refined version. The DS Lite launched in March 2006 in Japan and June 2006 in North America. It was a remarkable redesign that made the console approximately 20% smaller and 25% lighter than the original. The screens were now driven by higher quality components with improved brightness, which made outdoor play much more pleasant. The overall industrial design was sleeker and more refined, with less pronounced beveling and a more elegant aesthetic. The color options expanded significantly, with the Lite available in white, black, and eventually numerous other colors including special edition designs. The difference between the DS Fat and the DS Lite might seem minor to someone unfamiliar with either device, but to consumers it was substantial. The Lite felt like a device that had been polished and perfected. The improved screen brightness alone justified the upgrade for many early adopters. The more compact form factor made it significantly more pocket-friendly. The aesthetic refinement made the Lite feel more premium, more like a device someone might actually want to be seen carrying. Sales of the DS Lite exceeded the original DS almost immediately, and it became the definitive version of the DS for many players. The removal of the Game Boy Advance cartridge slot in the DS Lite was a controversial decision initially, but it proved prescient. The vast majority of DS owners had either never used the backward compatibility feature or had used it rarely. By removing the slot, Nintendo saved on manufacturing costs and was able to reduce the size of the device. Most consumers didn't miss the feature, particularly as the DS's own software library became increasingly compelling. The move demonstrated Nintendo's willingness to make pragmatic decisions about hardware features, removing elements that looked good on paper but didn't justify their space in real-world use. Throughout the DS Lite's tenure, Nintendo continued to refine and expand the color options. The system eventually became available in a dizzying array of colors and special editions. There were limited edition designs associated with specific games, color variants exclusive to specific regions, and custom designs. For a device that Nintendo sold for approximately $130–150, offering multiple aesthetic options was a strategy that encouraged multiple purchases. Collectors would buy multiple color variants, and upgrades from the original DS often involved purchasing a Lite in a preferred color, even if a consumer already owned an original DS. The DS and DS Lite, despite the redesign, shared identical internal specifications. This meant that software written for the original DS worked perfectly on the Lite without any modifications or updates. Developers didn't need to create separate versions or take into account different hardware capabilities. This backward compatibility for software was crucial for maintaining a unified software library. Publishers didn't need to make difficult decisions about which version of the hardware to target. The entire development community was working toward the same hardware specification. The market bifurcation that occurred with the Lite's release was interesting from a business perspective. For several months, Nintendo sold both the original DS and the DS Lite simultaneously. The original DS's price eventually dropped as the Lite became the flagship model. This created different market segments. Price-conscious consumers who didn't mind the fat's extra bulk bought cheaper original units, while those willing to pay a premium for the refined experience purchased the Lite. Eventually, the original DS was phased out entirely, but the pricing strategy allowed Nintendo to capture a broader market range. By 2007, the Nintendo DS had become more than just a successful gaming console. It had become a cultural phenomenon in a way that few gaming devices had achieved. The combination of innovative hardware, accessible software, and cultural timing had created something genuinely special. Games like Brain Age had convinced millions of people who didn't consider themselves gamers to purchase a DS. Nintendo's own franchises had adapted to the platform in compelling ways. Third-party developers had discovered innovative ways to use the touchscreen and dual screens. The achievement of this cultural penetration was particularly remarkable when compared to the PlayStation Portable. On paper, the PSP was the more impressive piece of hardware. It had better graphics, a larger screen, better media capabilities, and access to more sophisticated games. Yet the PSP never achieved the cultural ubiquity of the DS. This wasn't because the PSP was a bad console. It was an excellent device with a strong library, but rather because the DS had something that the PSP lacked. A fundamental innovation that changed how people thought about portable gaming. The touchscreen and dual screens weren't just gimmicks. They enabled entirely new types of games that simply couldn't exist on the PSP. Animal Crossing, Wild World, released for DS in 2005, demonstrated how Nintendo franchises could be successfully adapted for the portable platform. The game was a port of Animal Crossing, which had originated on the GameCube, but the DS version felt specially made for the platform. The touchscreen was used intuitively for menus and inventory management. The portable nature of the device made the game's real-time clock and seasonal changes feel more meaningful. Players could carry their village with them, continuing their daily interactions with villagers during commutes or lunch breaks. The game sold millions of copies and became a testament to how successful franchise adaptations could be. Mario Kart DS, released in 2005, proved that classic Nintendo franchises could thrive on the new hardware. The game featured the now classic Mario Kart gameplay with impressive track design that took advantage of the DS's capabilities. The Wi-Fi connectivity allowed online multiplayer gameplay, a feature that was becoming increasingly important in the mid-2000s. The game sold over 20 million copies and became the system's best-selling exclusive title, demonstrating that traditional hardcore gamers continued to embrace the console, despite its success with casual audiences. The year 2007 was particularly significant for the DS software library. The Legend of Zelda: Phantom Hourglass arrived, with an intriguing design where the entire game was built around the stylus as the primary input device. Rather than shoehorning the stylus into a traditional Zelda formula, the game reimagined Zelda for touch controls. Players would draw lines to direct Link, tap enemies to strike them, and manipulate the environment using the stylus. This was either brilliant or gimmicky, depending on whom you asked. Hardcore Zelda fans had mixed reactions, but the game sold millions of copies and proved that ambitious experimentation could work on the platform. Professor Layton and the Curious Village found massive success in the DS market, particularly in Europe and Japan. The Professor Layton series would become one of the DS's defining franchises. The games consisted of environmental exploration, conversation, and puzzle solving, all perfectly suited to the touchscreen interface. The mysteries were genuinely engaging, and the aesthetic was charming and distinctive. Level 5's work on the franchise established them as a major force in handheld game development. Scribblenauts, released in 2009, represented perhaps the most creative and ambitious use of the DS's touchscreen capabilities. The game allowed players to write words on the touchscreen, and those words would appear in the game world as objects or creatures. This seemingly simple mechanic created staggering possibilities. Players could summon ladders to climb, create ramps for characters to walk on, generate tools to solve puzzles, or spawn creatures to interact with the environment. The game's dictionary contained over 22,000 words. meaning the permutations of possible interactions were nearly infinite. Scribblenauts became a proof of concept that the touchscreen could enable gameplay that was fundamentally impossible on traditional consoles. The success of Nintendo's own Touch, Generations brand, which had begun with simple minigame collections, evolved into a broader casual gaming initiative. Games with names like Wii Sports and Wii Fit on the home console would later be mirrored by similar titles on the DS. While the DS's screen wasn't as immersive as the Wii's motion controls, it was still an effective tool for reaching casual audiences. Nintendo's commitment to casual gaming alongside hardcore titles was becoming clearer, and the DS was a proving ground for this dual approach. By the late 2000s, the DS had achieved something that no handheld gaming device had achieved before. It had become relevant to people across the entire demographic spectrum. Children played Pokemon and Mario games, teenagers played action games and RPGs, adults played Brain Age and Professor Layton. Families played Mario Party games together. The console had transcended the traditional gamer demographic in a way that the Game Boy had come close to achieving, but had ultimately not managed. The Game Boy's cultural penetration had been mostly about practical functionality and longevity. The DS's penetration was about having genuinely appealing games for everyone. The breadth of the DS software library by the late 2000s was genuinely staggering. Nintendo had done an exceptional job of cultivating third-party developer support, and the results were evident in the incredible diversity of games available. Publishers that had traditionally focused on console gaming were bringing major franchises to the portable system. Capcom, for instance, had committed strongly to the DS, releasing numerous titles including Street Fighter IV, Mega Man series entries, and Resident Evil games. The Dragon Quest franchise found tremendous success on the DS, particularly Dragon Quest Niv, Sentinels of the Starry Sky, which released in 2009. This was a particularly interesting case because Dragon Quest IX was developed as a multiplayer-focused experience with local and online cooperative gameplay. The game became a cultural phenomenon in Japan, with thousands of players gathering in public places like train stations to engage in wireless multiplayer sessions. The game demonstrated that the DS could handle ambitious RPGs and that the portable platform was ideal for multiplayer experiences that benefited from portability. Square Enix had a strong presence on the DS with numerous releases including The World Ends With You, a remarkably creative action RPG that used both screens in innovative ways, with battles occurring simultaneously on the top and bottom screens. The game's hip-hop influenced aesthetic and setting in modern-day Tokyo made it appealing to a broader audience than typical RPGs. The game made creative use of the microphone and motion controls, showing that third-party developers were willing to experiment with the DS's less obvious capabilities. Rhythm games found a particularly strong home on the DS. Beyond the previously mentioned Elite Beat Agents, numerous rhythm games released on the platform. Rhythm Heaven was a series of rhythm-based minigames that became beloved by players seeking challenging but accessible gaming experiences. The touchscreen proved ideal for rhythm games, allowing developers to create input methods that were more intuitive than traditional button-based approaches. Ubisoft had substantial success with the Splinter Cell, Rayman, and Assassin's Creed franchises on the DS. While these games obviously couldn't match the graphical fidelity or scope of their home console counterparts, they were often enjoyable experiences in their own right. The challenge of adapting complex console franchises to the DS's more limited hardware specifications created interesting design constraints that sometimes led to more focused, streamlined gameplay experiences. The Kirby series found new life on the DS with entries like Kirby, Canvas Curse, which used the stylus to create platforms for Kirby to traverse. The game was creative and charming, proving that Nintendo's classic franchises could be innovatively adapted for the new hardware. Kirby's return to the DS with later entries continued to showcase how beloved franchises could remain fresh on the portable platform. Japanese developers had particular success on the DS, perhaps because the console's innovation ethos aligned with Japanese gaming sensibilities. Beyond Square Enix and Capcom, developers like Grasshopper Manufacture, Vanillaware, and smaller independent studios created some of the DS's most memorable games. Travis Strikes Again developer Suda51 created multiple interesting experiences for the platform. Vanillaware's Odin Sphere found success on the DS as a port from the PlayStation 2. The visual novels and adventure game genres thrived on the DS. Games featuring elaborate stories, character development, and dialogue trees found an ideal home on the portable system. The Phoenix Wright series, developed by Capcom, became beloved by millions of players. These games weren't action games or platformers, but rather narrative-focused experiences that benefited from the portable platform's convenience. Players could engage with these narrative experiences during their commute or during lunch breaks. The sports game genre was represented on the DS through series like FIFA, Madden NFL, and NBA Live. While these versions were necessarily simplified compared to their home console counterparts, they provided sports fans with quick, convenient sports gaming experiences. The handheld market had its own sports game ecosystem that, while separate from the console ecosystem, was legitimate and successful in its own right. The success of third-party games on the DS demonstrated that the console's appeal extended far beyond Nintendo's own software. Publishers had seen the opportunity and had invested in the platform. Some experiments worked brilliantly, while others were less successful, but the diversity of approaches and genres represented on the DS was genuinely impressive. By the late 2000s, the DS had something for virtually every type of player, which was precisely Nintendo's intention. As the DS's install base grew, a robust accessory market developed. Third-party manufacturers created carrying cases, screen protectors, replacement styluses, and numerous other peripherals. These accessories served practical purposes, protecting the system and enhancing portability. Some custom styluses offered improved ergonomics or aesthetic customization. The replacement stylus market was particularly robust because the tiny original styluses were so easy to lose or damage. The Pokemon Pikachu-themed DS Lite and various branded versions of the hardware itself could be considered specialized accessories in a sense, though they were really just aesthetic variants of the existing hardware. The existence of these special editions demonstrated Nintendo's understanding that consumers didn't just want a gaming device. They wanted a device that expressed their personality and interests. The Wi-Fi connector was a crucial accessory for bringing online functionality to the DS before Wi-Fi was built into later models. This small USB adapter allowed the DS to connect to home internet networks for online gaming and downloading content. The Wi-Fi connector's existence demonstrated that Nintendo had initially anticipated network connectivity might be an optional feature for consumers rather than a mandatory inclusion. Over time, however, built-in Wi-Fi became standard. The thumb grips and other ergonomic accessories addressed concerns about extended stylus use potentially causing fatigue or discomfort. Some players found the built-in stylus uncomfortable for long gaming sessions, so third-party manufacturers offered alternatives with improved grip design. This peripheral market served an important role in addressing edge cases and individual player preferences that Nintendo's design couldn't satisfy for everyone. Rhythm game accessories proved popular, with various manufacturers creating drum pads and other input devices that could connect to the DS for rhythm games. While not as elaborate as arcade-quality rhythm game machines, these accessories provided an enhanced experience for players who wanted more physical feedback from their gaming. The fact that third-party developers created these kinds of peripherals showed that the DS ecosystem was robust enough to support innovation beyond what Nintendo itself was creating. The guitar peripheral developed by third-party manufacturers for rhythm games demonstrated that the DS could be adapted for non-traditional input devices. These peripherals connected to the DS through the cartridge slot or through wireless connections, opening possibilities for games that used non-traditional input methods. While most of these guitar accessories were aimed at specific games, they showed that the DS's form factor could accommodate different kinds of controllers and input devices. As the DS approached its 4th anniversary in 2008, Nintendo began planning the next evolution of the hardware. The DS Lite had been so successful that creating another redesign felt risky. What if consumers didn't see a compelling reason to upgrade? Yet Nintendo had identified several areas where the original DS and DS Lite design could be improved. These improvements would result in the DSi, which launched in Japan on November 1, 2008, and in North America on April 3, 2009. The DSi represented a more substantial redesign than the Lite had been. The device was slightly smaller and sleeker than the Lite, but the real innovations were internal and in the peripheral additions. The DSi included dual cameras, one on the outside of the device and one pointing inward. These cameras opened up new gameplay possibilities, particularly for photo-based games and applications. The DSi also featured a larger amount of internal storage and the ability to download games from the DSi shop, Nintendo's digital distribution platform. This shift toward digital distribution was significant because it represented a fundamental change in how games could be distributed to players. The cameras on the DSi were modest in quality by modern standards, but they were genuinely novel features for a gaming handheld in 2009. The outside camera allowed players to take photos that could be manipulated within games. The inside camera could be used for motion-controlled games, as players' movements would be tracked by the camera's video feed. Games like Photodecks and Picross 3D took advantage of these cameras in creative ways, though the feature never became as central to the gaming experience as Nintendo perhaps hoped. The built-in Wi-Fi was a subtle but significant improvement over the DS and DS Lite. The previous models required the Wi-Fi connector USB accessory to connect to home networks. By building Wi-Fi into the DSi, Nintendo made online gaming and content download more accessible. The system could now automatically search for and connect to available Wi-Fi networks. This hardware change meant that future games could rely on Wi-Fi connectivity being available, without developers having to account for players who might not have purchased the expensive accessory. The DSi shop was a revolutionary addition to Nintendo's handheld portfolio, representing the company's early entry into digital distribution for games. The shop allowed players to download games directly to the DSi's internal storage, rather than requiring a physical cartridge. This had several implications. Games could be more easily updated or patched by developers. Impulse purchases could occur directly through the console without a trip to a retail store, and pricing could be adjusted more dynamically. The DSi shop would become the precursor to the 3DS eShop, which would be far more successful and central to the 3DS's ecosystem. The removal of the Game Boy Advance cartridge slot, which had already occurred with the DS Lite, continued with the DSi. By 2009, this was not controversial. The GBA had been out of production for years, and the DS's software library was so vast that the majority of players had no need for backward compatibility. This space saved by not including the GBA slot was used for other improvements, demonstrating Nintendo's commitment to continuously optimizing the hardware design. Storage was another area where the DSi made a meaningful improvement. The previous DS models had essentially no built-in storage. The DSi included a modest amount of internal storage, measured in megabytes, which could store a small number of downloaded games. This was a modest amount by modern standards, but it was sufficient for the small-scale downloads that the DSi shop offered. Consumers concerned about storage capacity could purchase expandable SD cards, which the DSi supported. This expandability was crucial for allowing players to accumulate a meaningful digital library. The DSi's price point was interesting from a market positioning perspective. At approximately $170 USD, it was more expensive than the DS Lite had been at launch. This premium price reflected the added hardware features and the company's confidence that sufficient numbers of players would see value in the upgrade. While some consumers balked at the price, many early adopters embraced the DSi as the natural evolution of the platform. Sales were respectable, though not explosive. By this point in the product cycle, the DS's primary success was already secured, and the DSi represented an opportunity to upgrade rather than the primary driver of new console adoption. The DSi XL arrived in March 2009 in Japan, and later that year in North America and Europe. This larger variant featured significantly bigger screens. The 3.25-inch screens were about 20% larger than the DSi's screens, making the device more comfortable for extended play sessions and easier to see for older players. The DSi XL came at a premium price point, approximately $200 USD, which positioned it as a premium variant for players who valued screen size over portability. The DSi XEL was particularly successful in Japan and Europe, where it found an audience among players who found the standard DSi's screen size slightly cramped. The DSi and DSi XL essentially coexisted with the DS Lite for several years. Nintendo didn't immediately discontinue the Lite, choosing instead to offer multiple SKUs at different price points. This strategy allowed price-conscious consumers to purchase a DS Lite at a reduced price point, while players willing to pay more could opt for the DSi or DSi XL. Over time, the DSi became the primary model, eventually replacing the DS Lite as Nintendo's focus. The DSi's cultural moment was somewhat different from the original DS and DS Lite. By 2009, the DS was already a mainstream device, with an enormous install base and extensive software library. The DSi's improvements were meaningful but incremental. The systems were not substantially different in capability or aesthetic from the Lite, which meant the primary driver for upgrade wasn't game-changing new features, but rather the desire to have the most current version of the hardware. As time passed, the DSi's popularity grew, but it never achieved the ubiquity the original DS and DS Lite had enjoyed. The DSi shop represented Nintendo's first serious attempt at digital distribution for handheld gaming. While online content distribution was becoming increasingly normal by 2009, Nintendo had been cautious about embracing it. The company still relied heavily on retail relationships, and a shift toward digital distribution could have threatened those relationships. However, the DSi shop represented a measured approach. It offered older games and smaller titles, without immediately replacing physical retail distribution as the primary method of game delivery. The DSi shop's library included both Nintendo-developed titles and third-party content. developers could create small, downloadable games specifically designed for digital distribution. This was an early form of what would later be called indie game development, though the term wasn't widely used in 2009. The ability to distribute small games directly to consumers without going through the retail distribution chain represented a fundamental shift in how games could reach players. The pricing on the DSi shop was generally modest. Many games were priced at 200 to 800 Nintendo points, which translated to approximately $2 to $8 USD. These price points were deliberately lower than physical games, which typically sold for $30 to $40, reflecting both the lower production costs of digital distribution and the smaller scope of many downloadable titles. Over time, the DSi shop's library would expand significantly, though it would never rival the library of physical games available for the platform. The DSi version of classic Game Boy and Game Boy Color games proved popular. Nintendo released digital versions of titles like The Legend of Zelda, Link's Awakening, Kirby's Dream Land, and other beloved games. These versions were perfect reconstructions of the original games with minimal enhancement, but their availability through digital distribution meant players didn't need to hunt for aging cartridges on the used market. This retrospective licensing of classic games helped establish the DSi shop as a destination for both new content and gaming history. The DSi shop represented a transitional moment in gaming history. Physical games remained the primary distribution method, but digital was beginning to expand its presence. The modest success of the DSi shop provided valuable data and experience that Nintendo would leverage when launching the 3DS eShop a few years later. The 3DS eShop would be far more successful and would eventually become the primary method of game distribution for that system, but the DSi shop had proven the concept could work. By 2010, the Nintendo DS had become a juggernaut. The system had been on the market for 6 years in some regions, and had accumulated an enormous installed base and software library. Sales figures told a remarkable story. Over 130 million DS units had been sold worldwide across all variants. The system had become the second best-selling game console of all time, behind only the PlayStation 2. This was an extraordinary achievement for a handheld device that had launched with skepticism about its touchscreen and dual-screen gimmick. The software library had grown to include over 3,600 games. This vast library meant that virtually any type of game, any genre, any theme, any playstyle, had multiple options on the DS. A player interested in strategy games could choose from Fire Emblem, Final Fantasy Tactics A2, or dozens of other options. A player interested in action games could pick from Mega Man, Castlevania, or numerous other franchises. The breadth of this library was extraordinary and represented the culmination of years of developer support and Nintendo's cultivation of the third-party ecosystem. The late-life success of the DS was partly driven by the continued release of high-quality software. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon games, Dragon Quest IX, and numerous other titles kept the platform feeling fresh and relevant. Publishers committed to the DS, even as other systems evolved and newer hardware launched. This long-tail success was driven by the reality that the DS's installed base remained massive, even as its initial surge of momentum had passed. The competition from the PlayStation Portable had largely faded by 2010. The PSP was a respectable handheld with its own merits, but it had never achieved the cultural penetration of the DS. The PSP's strengths, its superior graphics, its media capabilities, its library of more mature games, hadn't translated into the kind of mainstream success that the DS had achieved. By 2010, the PSP was in its twilight years, with Sony preparing to launch the PlayStation Vita as its successor. The DS's dominance of the handheld market was essentially complete. The price of DS hardware had dropped significantly from its launch price. The DS Lite, which had originally cost $150, was now available for $100 or less. The DSi remained at approximately $170, while the DSi XL was the premium option at $200. These reduced prices made the DS more accessible to players who'd been priced out earlier in the product cycle. Parents could purchase a DS for their children without spending $150–200. Students could buy a used DS for minimal cost. The declining price created waves of new consumers entering the ecosystem throughout the product lifecycle. The phenomenon of the DS was particularly remarkable in how it had transcended traditional gaming demographics. The system had achieved mainstream status in a way that few gaming devices ever did. It wasn't uncommon to see people of all ages on public transportation playing their DS. The device had achieved cultural penetration comparable to the original Game Boy, but with a far broader appeal across age groups. Children, teenagers, adults, and seniors all had reasons to own and enjoy a DS. The role of specific games in driving this phenomenon couldn't be overstated. Brain Age had attracted millions of non-traditional gamers. Pokémon had attracted the hardcore gaming audience and the casual crossover audience. New Super Mario Bros. Had proven that traditional gaming experiences remained relevant on the new hardware. Mario Kart DS had delivered multiplayer gaming that was both accessible and deep. The combination of these anchor titles, supported by a vast library of diverse games, had created something genuinely special. The Nintendo DS's technical architecture, while modest by the standards of home consoles, was carefully designed to enable the system's unique capabilities. The dual-screen setup required innovative solutions. Each screen required its own data pipeline. The touchscreen technology on the bottom screen added complexity to the system architecture. The relatively modest processing power meant that developers had to be creative in how they optimized their code. The memory configuration of the DS was interesting from a design perspective. With 4 MB of RAM, the system had less memory than the PlayStation 2 or Xbox, but the RAM was optimized for the specific needs of the hardware. The system architecture allowed for efficient caching of graphics data and quick context switching between the two screens. Developers learned to work within these constraints, and many created impressive games despite the hardware limitations. The cartridge format used for DS games was proprietary to Nintendo, which meant that games were locked into the DS ecosystem. This was different from more open platforms, but wasn't unusual for Nintendo. The cartridge format allowed for instant loading without the game installation times that CD-based systems required. Games started instantly when the cartridge was inserted, which was valuable for a portable device where players might play in short bursts. The graphics capabilities of the DS were often understated. While the system couldn't match the visual fidelity of the PlayStation 2, it was capable of rendering reasonably impressive 3D graphics. Games like Metal Gear Solid, Peace Walker on PSP's successor, but arriving years earlier on DS with titles like Splinter Cell games, demonstrated that 3D games could look quite good on the system when developers optimized properly. The two-screen setup actually provided some opportunities for creative graphic solutions. For instance, a game could render a high-quality view on one screen and supplementary information on the other. The DS's wireless capabilities were perhaps more important to its success than any of its other technical features. The built-in wireless hardware allowed for local multiplayer games without the need for link cables or external connections. Up to 16 players could theoretically connect via wireless for compatible titles. This wireless connectivity transformed how portable gaming worked, allowing player groups to easily connect and play together. The wireless feature had several technical implications. Games could use wireless for cooperative multiplayer, competitive multiplayer, or even for distributing game demos to other systems. The demo download feature, mentioned earlier, was particularly important because it allowed consumers without a cartridge to experience a game on someone else's DS system. This was valuable for marketing and social gaming. Friends could share games, experience them together, and make informed purchasing decisions. The online capabilities that the DSi introduced through the built-in Wi-Fi represented a significant expansion of the DS's multiplayer capabilities. Online multiplayer games like Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, Mario Kart DS, and numerous other titles could now connect to online servers rather than only supporting local wireless. This opened up possibilities for competitive and cooperative play with distant players rather than only those in physical proximity. The online infrastructure, while modest by modern standards, was revolutionary for the mid-2000s on a handheld system. The Wi-Fi connectivity of the DSi also enabled other online features like the shop and content delivery. Patches or updates for games could theoretically be delivered over the internet, though this capability was rarely used for DS games. The Wi-Fi infrastructure would become far more important with the 3DS, which made online connectivity a central feature of the platform experience. The success of the Nintendo DS, when compared to competitors like the PlayStation Portable, reveals something important about game design and hardware philosophy. The PSP had superior graphics processing, a larger library of complex games, and was, in many ways, more ambitious. Yet the DS captured a broader audience and achieved greater cultural penetration. The reasons for this had to do with Nintendo's design philosophy and how deliberately the company had positioned the DS as an accessible device. The touchscreen, which many initial critics thought was a gimmick, proved to be genuinely transformative. Rather than forcing the stylus into games where it didn't belong, developers learned to create games where touch input was natural and intuitive. Puzzle games, strategy games, and adventure games all found the touchscreen to be a superior input method compared to traditional buttons. The most successful games on the DS were often those that fully embraced the touchscreen, rather than those that tried to replicate traditional button-based gameplay through stylus taps. The dual-screen design created possibilities that no single-screen device could offer. Map displays on one screen while action occurred on another, inventory on one screen while exploration happened on another, or simultaneous top-screen and bottom-screen action in games like The World Ends With You. These dual-screen possibilities encourage developers to think about screen layout and information presentation in new ways. The color and aesthetic design of the DS was deliberately neutral. The device came in various colors but maintained a generally inoffensive mainstream appearance. This was intentional. Nintendo wanted the DS to be a device that appealed to everyone, not a device with a specific gaming aesthetic that might alienate non-traditional players. Compared to the PSP, which had a more tech-forward aesthetic that emphasized gaming prowess, the DS's appearance was more subdued and consumer-friendly. The Nintendo DS sold over 154 million units worldwide across all hardware variants. To put this in context, this made it one of the best-selling gaming devices of all time, regardless of whether you're comparing it to handheld or home consoles. Only the PlayStation 2 and the Nintendo Wii, among dedicated gaming devices, had higher overall sales numbers. The DS's 154 million unit sales figure is particularly impressive, considering it was a handheld device competing against the also successful PlayStation Portable for a significant portion of its life cycle. the demographic breakdown of DS ownership was remarkably diverse. Unlike previous handheld gaming devices, which skewed younger, the DS appealed across a wide age range. Surveys indicated that a substantial portion of DS owners were over 30 years old, a demographic that gaming devices had historically struggled to reach. The success with older players was particularly driven by Brain Age and other casual titles, but the broad appeal of the library meant that this demographic remained engaged with other types of games as well. The gender breakdown of DS ownership was also notably more balanced than previous gaming devices. While gaming had traditionally skewed heavily male, the DS's diverse library and approachable aesthetic attracted female players at substantially higher rates than previous platforms. Games like Animal Crossing, Elite Beat Agents, and Brain Age had particular appeal to female players, and their success demonstrated that the casual gaming market wasn't just an untapped demographic, but a massive one. Regional sales figures for the DS showed variations that were interesting from a market perspective. The system performed exceptionally well in Japan, where cultural factors like the popularity of commuting by train meant that portable gaming was particularly relevant. North America embraced the DS enthusiastically, making it a massive success there as well. Europe's reception was somewhat more subdued initially, but grew substantially over the console's life cycle. Worldwide, the DS achieved success in a way that few gaming devices had, becoming a global phenomenon rather than a regional one. The sales momentum of the DS had interesting patterns. The initial launch saw respectable but not explosive sales. The release of games like New Super Mario Bros. And Pokémon games in 2006 drove significant growth. The launch of the DS Lite in 2006 created another surge of sales as existing consumers upgraded and new consumers entered. The DSi's launch in 2008-2009 provided another refresh cycle, though with less dramatic sales impacts than the Lite had created. By the late 2000s, the console was in a steady state where sales remained strong but weren't dramatically growing. The Nintendo 3DS launched in early 2011, representing Nintendo's next generation of handheld gaming. The 3DS would become the successor to the DS, but the transition between generations was gradual rather than abrupt. The DS continued to receive new games and support well into the 3DS era. Nintendo maintained a two-platform handheld ecosystem for several years, supporting both the aging DS and the new 3DS hardware. This approach was similar to how Nintendo had managed the Game Boy to Game Boy Color transition, but with more intentional support for both platforms running in parallel. The 3DS introduced several new features that were revolutionary for handheld gaming, most notably the glasses-free 3D display that gave the system its name. The 3DS's graphics were substantially more powerful than the DS's, and the system introduced a new cartridge format. Despite these improvements, the 3DS was not immediately positioned as a replacement that made the DS obsolete. Instead, Nintendo encouraged players who were satisfied with their DS systems to continue using them, while the 3DS attracted new consumers and those seeking the enhanced capabilities. The DS's software library continued to see new releases even as the 3DS launched. The period from 2011 to 2013 saw a surprising number of high-quality DS games released, particularly in Japan. Developers continued to create for the aging platform because the install base remained enormous, and the development tools were well established. The gradual transition from DS to 3DS represented a gentle shift rather than an abrupt discontinuation of support. By the mid-2010s, the Nintendo DS had become a legacy system. The 3DS had replaced it as Nintendo's primary handheld gaming platform, and the DS's era of new releases had largely concluded. Yet the console's cultural impact remained significant. The installed base of over 154 million units meant that DS consoles and games remained readily available in the used market. Retro gaming enthusiasts discovered or rediscovered the system's remarkable library. Nintendo itself continued to support some aspects of the DS ecosystem, though with declining resources and attention. The DS's final years saw a curious phenomenon. Young players who had grown up with the 3DS or later mobile gaming were discovering the DS through used purchases or hand-me-downs. The console's accessibility, affordability in the used market, and incredible software library meant that it remained a relevant entry point into gaming for new audiences. Parents who had owned a DS as adults now purchased one for their children, either a classic DS they had preserved or a new-to-them purchase from the used market. The discontinuation of the DSi shop occurred in 2017, marking an official end to digital distribution support for the DSi and DSi XL. Players who had downloaded games to their systems would retain access to those games, but new downloads would no longer be possible. This closure represented a symbolic end to the DS era, though the system itself continued to function for playing physical games. The closure of the shop also highlighted Nintendo's limitations in preserving digital games, an issue that would become increasingly relevant as the company transitioned to digital-first distribution with later systems. The Nintendo Wi-Fi connection, the online service that powered DS and Wii Online multiplayer, was discontinued in May 2014. This meant that online multiplayer games could no longer connect to Nintendo's servers. Local multiplayer continued to function, and many games that had relied on online connectivity fell back to local-only functionality. The discontinuation of the online service represented an end of an era, but didn't immediately render the DS incompatible with playing games. It simply limited the functionality of online features. The Nintendo DS software library numbered over 3,600 games, making it one of the largest game libraries ever created for a single platform. This library represented an extraordinary breadth of genres, styles, and experiences. The diversity of this library meant that decades after the console's release, new players could discover games on the platform that perfectly matched their interests. Retro gamers exploring the DS library often found unexpected gems that had been overlooked during the system's active years. The most successful games on the DS had lasting impacts on the industry. New Super Mario Bros. Revitalized interest in 2D platformers, leading directly to the new Super Mario Bros. Franchise that would continue across multiple platforms. The Pokémon games on the DS sold tens of millions of copies and continue to be played by retro gaming enthusiasts. Professor Layton's success on the DS established Level 5 as a major developer and proved that puzzle adventure games could have mainstream appeal. The Nintendo Wii would launch in November 2006, just a year and a half after the DS's North American launch. Remarkably, many of the design philosophy elements of the DS, accessibility, innovation in input methods, focus on a broad audience, would carry forward into the Wii's design. The Wii and DS ecosystems would exist in parallel, both succeeding in capturing both hardcore gamers and a broader casual audience. The cultural moment created by Nintendo with the DS paved the way for even greater success with the Wii, which would become the best-selling home console of its generation. The success of motion control on the Wii and later the DS's own motion control experiments suggested that Nintendo's willingness to experiment with input methods extended beyond just the touchscreen. The fact that both the Wii and DS succeeded with unconventional input methods suggested something important. Innovation in how games are controlled not just how powerful the hardware is, could be transformative. This philosophy would eventually influence nearly every major company in the gaming industry, with motion control becoming a feature on competing platforms. The Nintendo DS received mixed initial reactions from gaming critics and industry observers. Many questioned whether the touchscreen was a necessary feature and whether it would gimmick its way to success before fading. These early skeptics were proven wrong as the system's success became undeniable. By the late 2000s, critical opinion had shifted dramatically, with gaming critics recognizing the DS as one of the most important gaming platforms of the generation. The system won numerous industry awards and accolades. Gaming publications consistently rank the DS among the greatest game consoles of all time. The Smithsonian Institution's 2012 exhibition, The Art of Video Games, included multiple DS games as representative of the platform's cultural impact. The recognition of the DS in cultural institutions indicated that it had transcended simple commercial success to become recognized as a culturally significant artifact. The retrospective appreciation of the DS has only grown in the years since its active commercial life cycle ended. Retro gaming communities actively celebrate the console and its library. New games continue to be created for the DS by homebrew developers and enthusiasts, extending the platform's active development past what Nintendo itself continues to support. The DS has become one of the most beloved gaming platforms in retrospective discussions and rankings of the greatest game consoles of all time. Gaming historians recognize the DS as a pivotal moment in the evolution of gaming platforms. The console's combination of technical innovation, the touchscreen and dual screens, market innovation, positioning the device for a broader audience, and software quality created a template that other companies would attempt to replicate. The Nintendo Switch, released in 2017, owes significant intellectual debt to the DS's philosophy of hybrid gaming and portable console flexibility. The rise of mobile gaming on smartphones, which accelerated dramatically after the 2008 launch of the Apple App Store, could have spelled the end of dedicated handheld gaming consoles. Industry observers in the late 2000s frequently predicted that smartphones would eventually replace dedicated gaming devices. The prediction was partially correct. Dedicated handheld gaming consoles have declined in market share and cultural relevance since the rise of smartphones. However, the Nintendo DS's legacy of creating innovative gaming experiences that took advantage of dedicated hardware proved valuable. While smartphones gradually captured a significant portion of the casual gaming market that the DS had pioneered with Brain Age and similar titles, dedicated handheld consoles continued to find an audience with players who wanted more sophisticated gaming experiences. The Nintendo 3DS and later the Nintendo Switch both succeeded despite the prevalence of mobile gaming, suggesting that the market for dedicated handheld gaming remained viable despite competitive pressure from smartphones. The DS's success with both hardcore and casual audiences meant that the platform served as a bridge between dedicated gaming devices and casual gaming. Some casual players who discovered gaming on the DS eventually moved to smartphones for their gaming, while others graduated to more sophisticated gaming experiences on the same platform. The DS's ecosystem showed that a single platform could serve audiences across the entire spectrum, from non-gamers to hardcore enthusiasts, a lesson that influenced how later platforms were designed and marketed. As the DS ages into genuine retro status, concerns about preservation and accessibility have emerged. The physical cartridges, while durable compared to some media formats, are subject to degradation over decades. Cartridges can develop contact oxidation on the connectors, making them unreliable. The systems themselves will eventually fail as components degrade. The digital games that were sold through the DSi shop are at risk of becoming inaccessible if the servers that hosted them are not properly preserved. Nintendo's approach to digital preservation for the DS has been complicated. Unlike some other platforms where emulation is straightforward, the DS's hybrid architecture and specific hardware features have made emulation more challenging. However, dedicated enthusiasts have created increasingly sophisticated DS emulators that can play most games accurately. These emulators, while legally controversial in terms of copyright, have become the most reliable way to ensure that DS games remain playable as original hardware ages. The preservation of the DS library has also led to increased interest in game documentation and archival. Enthusiasts have created comprehensive databases of DS games, including metadata, reviews, and information about gameplay. The Library of Congress's game preservation program has included DS games in its archival efforts, recognizing the cultural significance of the platform and the need to preserve its software heritage. The DS's success was global, but not uniform across regions. Different markets embraced the console with varying degrees of enthusiasm and valued different aspects of its library. In Japan, the DS was a cultural phenomenon, with commuters on every train seemingly playing one. The portable nature of the console, combined with Japan's train culture and preference for handheld gaming, made it an ideal platform for the region. Japanese developers created an enormous number of DS games, some of which were never localized for Western audiences. In North America, the DS achieved extraordinary success among both hardcore gamers and casual audiences. The presence of franchises like Pokémon, Mario, and The Legend of Zelda meant that existing Nintendo fans had reasons to purchase the system. The surprising success of casual titles like Brain Age indicated that the system had achieved penetration into demographics that had previously been underrepresented in gaming. The presence of the DS was pervasive in schools, with teachers and parents often purchasing systems for educational value. In Europe, the DS's reception was somewhat more subdued during its early years, but it eventually became a major success. The European market had different preferences in some cases, with particular affinity for certain game series and different genre preferences compared to Japan and North America. The existence of region-specific releases and localization decisions reflected how Nintendo tailored the platform's presentation to different markets. In emerging markets, the DS's affordable used market created opportunities for gaming access that otherwise might not have existed. As the console aged and prices dropped, it became an entry point for gaming in markets where new console releases were prohibitively expensive. The durability of the DS hardware meant that used systems could be resold multiple times, creating a thriving secondary market that expanded access. The Nintendo DS's influence on the gaming industry extended far beyond its own commercial success. The console demonstrated that innovation in input methods and platform design could be more important than raw technical power. This lesson influenced how subsequent platforms were designed, with companies investing more heavily in unique input methods and novel hardware features. The DS's success with motion control, particularly after the Wii's success, inspired motion control features on competing platforms. The PlayStation Move and Xbox Kinect were direct responses to the success of motion-based gaming that the Wii had pioneered with a design philosophy influenced by the DS. The fact that motion control has proven to be a transitional phase in gaming, rather than a permanent feature of all consoles, doesn't diminish the DS's role in demonstrating that input method innovation could drive platform success. The touchscreen innovation of the DS influenced how mobile devices were designed. While touchscreen technology predated the DS, the commercial success of touch-based gaming on the platform helped establish touchscreens as the default input method for portable devices. The iPhone, released in 2007, came after the DS had already demonstrated the viability and consumer appeal of touchscreen interfaces. The DS and iPhone together created a cultural moment where touchscreen interfaces became dominant in portable devices. The DS's market positioning as an accessible device aimed at a broad audience influenced how the Wii was marketed and designed. The Wii's success in capturing casual audiences and expanding the definition of what gaming could mean built on the foundation that the DS had established. The Nintendo Switch, released decades after the DS, carries forward the spirit of accessible, innovative gaming that the DS pioneered, combining handheld and docking capabilities in a way that builds on the DS's dual-screen accessibility philosophy. The Nintendo DS achieved cultural penetration that extended beyond just gaming circles. References to the DS appeared in television shows, movies, and popular media. The console became iconic enough that it was recognized by non-gamers and represented as a symbol of casual gaming and accessibility. The distinctive shape of the clamshell DS became recognizable across demographics. The nostalgia for the DS among players who grew up with it has been particularly strong. A generation of players have fond memories of playing Brain Age on their commute, or discovering Pokémon Sapphire or Pearl during their school years. The DS was often the first gaming device that many players owned, making it an emotionally significant artifact from their childhood or adolescence. This nostalgic attachment has fueled retrospective appreciation and continued interest in the platform decades after its commercial peak. The DS's presence in retrospective gaming media has been consistent and positive. Top gaming console lists regularly include the DS among the greatest systems ever made. Gaming retrospectives and documentaries frequently highlight the DS as a pivotal moment in gaming history. The platform's influence on subsequent systems and its cultural impact have secured its place in gaming history as one of the most important consoles ever created. The internet preservation of DS gaming memories has been extensive. Fan communities dedicated to specific DS games or the platform as a whole maintain active discussions and content creation decades after the console's peak. YouTube channels dedicated to DS gaming and retrospectives have attracted millions of views. The passion of the DS community has kept the platform in cultural conversation long after it would have otherwise faded from memory. Beyond its market success and cultural impact, the Nintendo DS was a genuine technological achievement. The engineering required to create a dual-screen handheld device with a resistive touchscreen, 2 processors, wireless capabilities, and respectable battery life in 2004 was substantial. The design challenges of creating a comfortable, durable device that could withstand years of use and user abuse were real, and resulted in a remarkably robust piece of hardware. The wireless technology that allowed local multiplayer gaming without external accessories represented innovation in handheld game design. The implementation of this technology in a way that was power efficient enough not to significantly impact battery life was a genuine engineering accomplishment. The later addition of built-in Wi-Fi in the DSi represented further engineering achievement. The creation of the DSi with its dual cameras, despite the cameras being modest in capability, represented engineering complexity and miniaturization and integration. The addition of internal storage and expandable SD card support added value without significantly increasing the device's footprint or weight. These were not revolutionary technologies individually, but their integration into a portable gaming device represented solid engineering choices. The graphics processing capabilities of the DS, while modest, were impressive given the power and thermal constraints of a battery-powered portable device. The fact that developers were able to create games with reasonably detailed 3D graphics on the DS demonstrated the efficiency of the hardware design and the skill of developers in optimization. The Nintendo DS represented a significant economic success for Nintendo. The console and its software library generated billions of dollars in revenue over its commercial life cycle. The hardware sales alone represented hundreds of millions of dollars. When combined with software sales, digital distribution through the DSi shop, and peripheral accessories, the total economic impact of the DS was enormous. The console's success had ripple effects throughout the gaming industry. Publishers who had committed to DS development often saw substantial financial returns, incentivizing continued investment in the platform. The success demonstrated to publishers that handheld gaming was economically viable and worth serious development investment. This recognition influenced how publishers allocated development resources across platforms. The creation of new franchises and the revitalization of existing franchises on the DS meant that Nintendo's portfolio of intellectual property was enriched by the platform's success. Brain Age, Professor Layton, and other new franchises that found success on the DS became valuable long-term assets for Nintendo. The expansion of existing franchises like Pokémon, Mario, and Zelda on the DS meant that these franchises remained culturally relevant across multiple generations. The console's success also had economic implications for third-party developers and publishers. Companies that had been small or struggling before the DS sometimes found significant financial success by developing strong DS libraries. The opportunity to publish on the DS platform created jobs and revenue for development studios around the world. The economic impact of the DS on the gaming industry extended far beyond Nintendo itself. The Nintendo DS stands as one of the most important gaming platforms ever created. From its revolutionary dual-screen, touch-based hardware design to its extraordinary software library spanning 3,600+ games, the DS represented a moment when a company's willingness to innovate and take risks resulted in something genuinely transformative. The console didn't just succeed commercially, it changed how the gaming industry thought about platform design, input methods, and market positioning. The DS's influence extends beyond gaming into broader technology culture. The success of the touchscreen input method helped establish touchscreens as the default interface for portable devices. The platform's market positioning as an accessible device aimed at a broad audience established a template that other companies would attempt to replicate. The console's philosophy of innovation through clever design rather than raw processing power influenced how subsequent platforms were conceptualized and created. The DS remains beloved by millions of players who grew up with the system. The console represents a unique moment in gaming history when a platform achieved both critical acclaim and mainstream cultural penetration. It was equally at home in the hands of a hardcore gamer playing a complex RPG, and in the hands of a casual player enjoying Brain Age or a Pokémon game. This universal appeal is rare and represents one of the DS's greatest achievements. As handheld gaming has evolved and shifted with the rise of smartphone gaming and hybrid consoles, the DS's legacy has only grown stronger in retrospect. Gaming historians recognize it as a watershed moment in platform design and market strategy. Retro gaming enthusiasts actively celebrate and preserve the platform and its software library. New players continue to discover the DS and its remarkable library, experiencing for themselves why this console was so transformative. The Nintendo DS's 154 million unit sales and 3,600 plus game library represent the culmination of an extraordinary vision executed brilliantly by talented engineers, designers and developers. The console's clamshell design has become iconic. Its dual screens and touchscreen have become the subject of countless retrospectives and analyses. Its software library continues to delight new generations of players discovering it for the first time or rediscovering it with nostalgia. As the Nintendo DS ages into genuine retro status, its importance to gaming history only becomes clearer. The console was not just commercially successful, it was culturally transformative. It changed what gaming could mean and who could be a gamer. It demonstrated that innovation in how we interact with games could be as important as innovation in how powerful the hardware is. The DS's legacy lives on in every touchscreen device, in every innovative input method on subsequent gaming platforms, and in the hearts of millions of players who experience something genuinely special with this remarkable handheld gaming device. Thank you for drifting through this history with me. The Nintendo DS was a sleeping giant that awakened the gaming world to new possibilities, and now, as you close your eyes for rest, let that legacy of innovation and creativity follow you into peaceful dreams.